In a modern and isolated prison in the southern United States, a supernatural event was about to alter the fate of Elijah Carter. This 43-year-old man, a carpenter by trade, found himself in a narrow cell, enduring the unbearable anticipation of the day he would be led to the electric chair, accused of a crime he had continuously denied. His fate had been sealed after a swift trial tainted by bias, where the weakness of the evidence was swept aside by a jury eager to bring it to a close. Elijah, faced with this brutal and unjust sentence, embodied the tragic face of miscarriages of justice in an imperfect system, haunted by injustice and haste. With each rising day, Elijah felt the weight of his situation grow heavier. Every minute spent in his cramped and dark cell was a trial, a cruel reminder of his condemned state. The little light that filtered through the bars failed to ease the anxiety that overwhelmed him or to illuminate the dark thoughts that gradually consumed him. The deprivation of all contact with the outside world, the warmth of the sun, the scent of wood he once loved to work with, had turned his existence into an absolute void. The hours, often interminable, stretched in an oppressive silence that echoed his solitude. The distant sounds of footsteps and the sharp voices of guards constantly reminded him of the tightening grip around him. He endlessly relived, in a loop, the memories of his life before, peaceful and honest days marked by manual labor and the laughter of his family. Elijah recalled the long days spent sculpting wood, crafting furniture that the villagers appreciated for its quality. He had been respected for his integrity and dedication, values that the prison seemed to have reduced to dust. This cell, narrow and suffocating, had become the stage for his descent into an abyss of loneliness and despair. Elijah felt like a ghost, a man erased, reduced to a mere number in the prison records, doomed to disappear. The contrast between his former life and the reality that surrounded him was brutal. Imprisonment, darkness, insomnia. Each day brought him closer to the inevitable. To avoid falling completely, Elijah tried to cling to the few bright memories he still had the strength to summon. He thought of his wife, the laughter of his children, the evenings spent with family around the fire. These memories, despite their beauty, were also painful, as they reminded Elijah of what he risked losing forever, swept away by an unyielding and indifferent judicial machine. As the days passed, the hope for any kind of redemption faded, and Elijah felt a shroud of resignation weigh on him. Then, just days before the fateful date, a night like any other became the setting for a mysterious encounter that defied understanding. The oppressive silence of the prison was absolute, only punctuated by the heavy breathing and distant moans of other inmates. Elijah, lying on his cold cot, couldn't find sleep, lost in his dark thoughts. He had grown accustomed to the anxiety, the constant weight in his chest, to the inevitable tension reminding him that his last day was drawing near. But that night, a shiver ran down his spine, and a cold breath seeped into the air, slicing through the silence with an unreal intensity. He opened his eyes, slightly dazed, and saw in a dark corner of his cell a faint light that continued to grow, like a nascent flame. Slowly, this ghostly glow expanded, revealing the shape of a figure. At first, it was blurry, like an uncertain shadow. Then it sharpened, becoming that of an old man whose features reflected wisdom and kindness. His eyes, bright and deep, seemed to watch Elijah with an infinite tenderness and understanding, as though he knew every trial Elijah had endured. Elijah, frozen in shock, dared not move. His heart raced, but he felt strangely at peace, as if this apparition was dispelling his fears, wrapping his pain in a comforting warmth. The old man spoke no words, but in his silence, there was a language. His very presence seemed to whisper ancient truths, a quiet strength that surpassed human injustice. Slowly, with a supernatural gentleness, the apparition moved toward Elijah. It raised a translucent hand and gently placed it on his forehead. At the touch of this immaterial hand, Elijah felt a deep energy flow through him. It was as though a warm light was circulating through his body, soothing his fears, erasing his fatigue, and reminding him of forgotten memories of joy, peace, and love. His thoughts cleared, and a rush of long-buried sensations, memories of simple, forgotten happiness, surfaced once again. A message then etched itself into his mind, clear and powerful, like an inner voice rising from the mist. The truth will triumph, even if it takes time. Keep hope, Elijah. These words resonated within him, both a promise and a blessing, as though someone were assuring him that his suffering would not be in vain, that a justice greater than that of men was watching over him. The apparition slowly moved away, the light fading bit by bit, but leaving behind a nearly tangible atmosphere of serenity. Elijah remained still under the effect of this supernatural encounter. The cold of the cell seemed to have dissipated, and within his heart, a new spark had ignited. For the first time in months, he felt something other than fear and resignation, a fragile but persistent hope. In the following days, an odd serenity settled within Elijah. Even in the face of the guards and the concrete walls that seemed to condemn him, he retained that inner glow, that unshakable strength. He now had an intimate conviction that this injustice could not last forever, that something, somewhere, would break the invisible chains of his fate. Finally, the dreaded day arrived. Elijah, dressed in the orange uniform of the condemned, was escorted down the death row corridor, his wrists handcuffed and his ankles bound by chains that clinked with each step. The metallic sound echoed ominously in the walls, a grim sound that seemed to announce the inevitable outcome of this final march. Elijah kept his head high, despite the tension in the air, the apprehension in the eyes of the guards accompanying him, and the oppressive silence weighing on the prison. Each step brought him closer to the execution chamber, where the electric chair awaited him, coldly prepared for the ultimate sentence. As he crossed the threshold into the cold room, a shiver ran through him, freezing his spine. The room was austere, bathed in a sickly light that accentuated the coldness of the walls and the gleaming metal of the execution instruments. Witnesses were lined up behind a glass, silent and frozen like faceless shadows, there to witness what they considered the culmination of harsh justice. Their presence imposed a moral weight, a palpable tension, as if their mute gazes were impatiently fixed on the condemned. The guards strapped him into the chair with rigid, professional movements, though not without a sense of unease. Elijah felt his wrists and ankles firmly bound to the armrests and footrests of the chair, the leather creaking under the pressure. A technician applied electrodes with surgical precision, placing the metal sensors on his skull and arms, like a final rite before the inevitable. Elijah remained stoic, his eyes fixed straight ahead, though his mind wandered far from this morbid scene. He revisited the faces of his loved ones, his family, the memories of a simple but honest life, of his work as a carpenter where he found his dignity, his grounding in the world. In that suspended moment between life and death, an unexpected calm overtook him, almost supernatural. His gaze drifted into the void, but deep in his eyes, there was a strange peace. He knew, deep within himself, that he had nothing to reproach himself for, that this sentence was the result of a terrible mistake, a system that had relentlessly sought to crush him. This sense of innocence, however fragile, gave him a strange strength, allowing him to face the inevitable without succumbing to fear. The silence grew oppressive, suffocating, until the executioner, with mechanical, impassive movements, finally pulled the lever. A sharp sound sliced through the air, tearing the silence in one blow. The electric shock coursed through Elijah's body, an intense and relentless jolt. His muscles contracted under the current, his body convulsing in an involuntary spasm as the tension rose. The acrid smell of burnt flesh soon filled the room, infiltrating the air and leaving a metallic taste in the witnesses' mouths. Several of them, unable to bear the horror of the scene, turned away, their hearts knotted, murmuring silent prayers or closing their eyes to the raw violence of the moment. Then, after what seemed like an interminable few seconds, the machine stopped. Silence fell in the room, dense and oppressive, leaving space for a morbid anticipation. The atmosphere was heavy, as if the very breath of death had suspended itself in the air. The prison doctor, pale and tense, approached to pronounce the final verdict, confirming what everyone had thought inevitable, Elijah's death. But to everyone's astonishment, an incomprehensible event occurred. Slowly, as if emerging from darkness, Elijah opened his eyes. His eyelids fluttered, his chest rose slightly, and against all odds, he weakly lifted his head, his gaze distant and undefinable, like that of a man who had briefly glimpsed the afterlife. The doctor, struck by shock, stepped back a pace, but an irresistible force compelled him to check Elijah's vital signs. His trembling fingers pressed against the condemned man's wrist, and he felt, beneath the scorched skin, the faint but undeniable pulse of life. A murmur of disbelief spread among the witnesses behind the glass, some stifling cries of surprise, while others stared at Elijah, stunned. The faces, frozen in a mix of horror and awe, reflected the confusion that was sweeping through the entire room. The prison staff exchanged wide-eyed glances, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. How could a man come back to life after such an ordeal? This phenomenon, so rare it seemed legendary, had never been considered in the procedure manuals. Memories of an ancient, forgotten law resurfaced in the collective mind. An old legislation, recorded in the archives of justice but relegated to oblivion, stated that a condemned man who survived his execution must be set free, having symbolically paid his debt to society. This law, almost mythical, haunted the minds of those present, making them glimpse a justice beyond the human realm. Yet, this outcome confronted them with an unprecedented terror. It shattered the boundaries of reality, forcing the idea that something inexplicable had occurred, something their rational minds were not prepared to accept. The murmurs grew more oppressive, expressions of concern painted on the faces of the staff and witnesses. Doubt and fear crept into their minds, stirring an inner conflict between logic and mysticism, between the rigidity of the law and the undeniable reality of this miracle. No one in the room dared make the decision to acknowledge this improbable outcome. Recognizing that Elijah should be released meant admitting that human justice may have committed an irreparable mistake. This thought confronted them with a truth too profound, too terrifying, a superior justice that seemed to have rejected Elijah from death. Still strapped to the chair, Elijah, though weakened and disoriented, felt a mysterious clarity blooming within him. An impenetrable serenity inhabited him, a powerful and indefinable feeling. His eyes, filled with a transcendent peace, turned toward the figures of the witnesses beyond the glass, carrying a silent but penetrating message, like a mirror reflecting their own doubts and anxieties. The guards, shaken, remained frozen, unsure how to handle this situation that surpassed all predictions. Before them stood a man whom death itself seemed to have rejected, as if a higher power had manifested through him, forever altering Elijah's destiny, and perhaps the destinies of all those who had witnessed this inexplicable event. The news of the miracle man of the electric chair spread like wildfire, capturing the attention of the entire nation. Everywhere, citizens debated this fascinating mystery. How could a man survive an execution that was meant to be fatal? The media seized the case, organizing televised debates, investigative reports, and interviews with experts. Lawyers, doctors, psychologists, and even theologians were called to give their opinions on this troubling case. Social media ignited, fueling passionate discussions and raising questions about judicial errors and the right to life. Soon, Elijah became an unintended symbol of the fragility of the criminal justice system. Faced with mounting media pressure, the authorities had no choice but to launch a thorough investigation. Elijah's trial, which had previously gone unnoticed, was now scrutinized under a magnifying glass. Journalists and human rights activists uncovered disturbing details. Witnesses who had suddenly changed their testimonies, material evidence that appeared tampered with, and experts whose conclusions were dubious. The gaping flaws in his trial were now exposed, revealing a judicial vendetta motivated more by the desire to close the case than by a search for the truth. Under the immense pressure from the public and the media, a judicial review was ordered. The judges, aware of the significance of the case, mobilized independent experts to examine every detail of the prosecution's file. What they discovered was damning. The evidence against Elijah had been fabricated. Investigators had concealed crucial elements, and some key testimonies had been obtained under duress. Long-suppressed truths resurfaced, and the real culprit, who had lived in complete impunity, was finally unmasked and arrested. After years of injustice, Elijah was finally granted his freedom. When he stepped out of the prison gates, a crowd was waiting for him, cheering him as a hero, and the flashes of cameras illuminated his face, marked by the trials he had endured. This moment, although filled with exultant clamor, carried a heavy weight for Elijah, freedom tinged with bitterness and disillusionment. The years spent behind bars had left deep scars, visible in his aged features and in his once vibrant eyes, now filled with a silent gravity. The solitude, the endless nights, the accusatory gazes of the guards, and the weight of the false accusations had etched themselves into him, marking his soul as much as his body. Yet, despite the pain, Elijah stood tall, refusing to let this ordeal imprison him further through hatred and resentment. He realized that his story was not just that of a personal injustice but a reflection of the flaws in the system, and he made a pivotal decision: to transform his suffering into a positive force. Rather than retreat into the shadows, Elijah embraced a cause greater than himself, determined that no other innocent person should endure the same torment. Driven by an unwavering conviction, he embarked on a relentless fight for justice, speaking out for the voiceless and for all those whose lives had been unjustly shattered. Elijah quickly turned to activism, becoming a staunch advocate for prisoners' rights and victims of judicial errors. His touching and inspiring story drew media attention, and he became an iconic spokesperson. He participated in conferences, from university campuses to international summits, raising public awareness about the dangers of judicial errors and the urgent need to reform the criminal justice system. "Justice can be wrong, but the truth never falters," he would repeat in every speech, these words echoing as a promise, a silent vow to those who, like him once, were waiting for the truth to come to light. His impact extended beyond words. He actively engaged with organizations dedicated to defending the innocent, working day and night to rehabilitate those who, like him, had been wrongfully accused. Thanks to his involvement, cases were reopened, innocent people were freed, and new voices joined the movement for judicial reform. Elijah also became an advisor to reform committees, where he proposed practical solutions to ensure fairer trials, emphasizing transparency, the independence of experts, and access to quality defense for all. His journey, from the darkness of his cell to the spotlight, inspired thousands of people and transformed society's view of judicial flaws. Laws were changed, imposing stricter checks in investigations and a review of procedures to prevent more innocents from being crushed by the system. Elijah's voice became a symbol of resilience, reminding everyone that, even in the face of the most blind cruelty, a person has the power to rise and become the light they hoped to see. Ultimately, Elijah, the man whom death had spared, now lived to illuminate the flaws of an imperfect system and to restore hope to the innocent silenced by injustice. His freedom was not only his own, it belonged to all those he had chosen to defend. By his unwavering commitment, he proved that, in the face of the cruelest injustice, truth and hope will always triumph in the end.